great to see all of you here. Thank you very much for taking time to be here with us for this conference. I'm excited to share with you some thoughts that I have, some ideas based on the work that I've been doing with regard to learning in the generative AI. I know that my time is limited. I have about half an hour or so. So what I would like to do is to share with you some ideas that hopefully can spark off discussion in the sessions that you have, and of course during the tea break. I will also share with you some resources based on the work that I have done. So if you're interested, you can always follow up on that. Let's think about the role of the teacher. Well, since time immemorial, you think about the role of a teacher as the sage on the stage. Now, of course, supported by the PowerPoint, and there you go. Right, so the knowledge authority, the person that has the most content in the room. But obviously we know the internet has changed that, hasn't it? Right, so about 3 decades or so, there have been the recognition that perhaps we are not the sage on the stage, but rather the guide by the side. So we talk about how computers in the classroom require all of us to become facilitators of learning. But really, if you think about the focus on the knowledge authority, that is a teacher-centered pedagogy, that draws a lot of attention on the role of the teacher being the knowledge authority, the content disseminator. And then if you think about the role of the facilitator of learning, well, that focuses on the student, right? And that is where you begin to recognize the student as being important. So you design for student-centered learning classrooms. So you have the thesis, teacher-centered teaching and learning experiences, and then you have the antithesis, student-centered learning experiences. And Christian Matheson, a researcher in the field of functional linguistics, talks about how in time to come, when you have a thesis and an antithesis, there will come to a point where you need to have that synthesis, the recognition that there's a role to play for both aspects of learning. And more than that, there's also a gradual recognition as well in the last decade or so, even though the idea was popularized much earlier, that teachers are really designers of learning experiences, because there are certain stages in the learning experience where you need to be the sage on the stage. You need to be the one that consolidates, synthesizes, helps students to begin to frame the learning that they have, model the knowledge construction. But there are times where you have to take a step back and be at a side to allow students to lead in the learning process. The thinking that teachers are really designers of learning experience can be a really powerful one. The teacher takes on the role of a designer, and as a designer, you have to think about the kind of material resources and structures of power you have in a specific environment that express your meaning. So you have to think about the tools that you bring to the classroom, the affordances of technology. Well, the whiteboard that you have, the textbooks, but also tools like gamification platforms and generative AI, which is the focus of my session. So thinking about how this can change the way teaching and learning can take place in the classroom. Now, the notion of teachers as designers is not that new in a sense. It has been taken up by various organizations as well. I mean, there's a recognition that really pedagogy must be deliberately designed. Pedagogy requires teachers to have the understanding of how to design learning environments. And I think it's important for us to recognize that teachers are not just technicians, implementing the curriculum, but they have agency. We talk about Snyder talks about the hidden curriculum in terms of how we can design for meaningful learning activities in the classroom. Now, the notion of pedagogy as design stems from the work of the New London Group. So I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that, but have you heard of the term multiliteracies? Some of you may have, especially in the learning context. So, multiliteracies was introduced to the world by a group of academics met in New London. They call themselves the New London Group. And there, they introduced the notion of pedagogy as design. Both teachers and students are designers of meaning in the classroom and are shaping social interactions through communication. So again, I think the design paradigm is an important paradigm to think about when we reflect on the role of the teacher, especially in the age of generative AI. Now, part of the manifesto by the New London Group was the introduction of what they call the learning by design pedagogy. Now, if you look at the 4 quadrants, regardless of your inclinations of strategies in the classroom, you will find one that resonates with you. You'll find that there is the recognition of the importance of didactic transmission pedagogy, where the teacher consolidates, leads, models the learning. There's the importance of progressive and authentic pedagogy, where there's a reflection of how we need to connect with the students' life works. We need to draw in resources that relate to them so that they are able to bridge learning in the classroom with what they're experiencing out of the classroom. There's a recognition of critical pedagogy, recognizing that we need to equip students with critical literacies to be able to interrogate the text that they encounter, to interrogate knowledge as we speak, as well as the recognition of functional pedagogy, where we talk about applied learning, the maker's movement, learning through making, through doing. So essentially, the learning by design framework that's been developed by the New London Group by Bill Cope and Mary Calentis essentially is a recognition that teachers today require a repertoire of pedagogies to design specific learning experiences based on the unique profile of the students, based on the learning goals that you have. And I think it's inclusive because it's not saying that one is necessarily better than others. So it's not saying that, you need to have inquiry-based learning all the time, and that if the teacher talks too much, that is always bad. It's a recognition really that we need to foreground the importance of appropriateness, fit for purpose, rather than being very prescriptive about what is right or wrong. So the repertoire of pedagogies is something that we want our teachers in the classroom to develop. In my book, I also reflected on the role of the teachers as a designer of learning, and I thought about, based on my specialization in multimodality, how the teacher can design for meaningful learning experiences in the classroom. Well, using not just the words that are exchanged, but also other semiotic resources. For a long time, classroom research has focused very much on what the teacher says, what the student says. So some of you have heard of the IRE or IRF sequence: initiation, yes, response, good, feedback. So I'm demonstrating that, okay, IRE, IRF. So essentially based on Sinclair and Kotok's work in the classroom on what the teacher says and how the students respond accordingly. But that was very much limited by the fact that we were using tape recorders that was recording the audio of the teachers. But today, video recording is so prevalent and so easy. And you realize that the learning experience of the students is so much more than just the words of what they hear in the classroom. It really depends also on the teacher's use of gestures, movement, and position in the classroom. And in fact, I can go on this about how teachers can use very powerfully silent discourses in the classroom, gestures, to regulate some of the learning that is taking place. So if you're interested, obviously you can find more about this. I also want to draw your attention to the second aspect of learning. So in addition to seeing teachers as designers of learning experience, Günter Kress and Stefan Selander talks about the importance of recognizing learning as design. So what do we mean by learning as design? Every mode, every sign made is new and creative, and learning is about actively designing meaning. And it demands a range of different semiotic modes are used, speech, writing, in the ways in which meanings are made in the contemporary communication environment. So learning as design, this paradigm recognizes that students exercise agency in the classroom and also the centrality of their choice in meaning making. So it's about the availability of their student resources for meaning making, as well as how it's motivated by their own interest in their learning. So how does this look in the classroom? In a paper that we did to synthesize some of the work that the late Günter Kreis has done with regard to the notion of design in education, we talked about how the paradigm of learning as design challenges the singular focus on learning as competence that we currently have, right? So learning as competence, which is today's education systems in schools, focuses on students' building of knowledge and skills, and the focus on applying them with accuracy. So ultimately, we are interested in the product of their learning. So for instance, if you think about, well, I'm from the English language department, so how do I know that my students have learned the English language? Well, we get them to do a test, and we look at their writing, the essay that they produce. How do my colleagues know that their students have learned science concepts well? Well, we give them a test, and we look at the kind of answers they produce in the essays for science. So we focus a lot on the product of learning, right? Essentially, how can they demonstrate their competence of their understanding? However, learning as design focuses on students' augmentation and transformation of semiotic resources in the process of learning. So we are not just interested in the product of learning, but we are also interested in the process of learning, the learning process. Now you may say, okay, that makes sense. We are not just interested in the product, we are interested in the process. But how can I do it with a class of 40 students? I was in Cambodia last week and they tell me that they have 50 students in the classroom. How can I do it? How can I move beyond the product to look at the process of students' learning? How can I achieve the holy grail of personalized learning? That's what education is all about, right? We want to personalize the learning experience for our child. Well, perhaps technology can offer some solution towards that. The other aspect of learning as design is also about rebalancing the cognitive focus in the classroom with regard to also thinking about the affective and embodied domain. So if you think about the classroom, if you think about teaching and learning, a lot of time the interest is on what goes on in the mind of the students. How do we know that the students have learned? What are some of the cognition that is taking place? Well, in a work that we did, a paper that I published with Cope and Calentis, we talk about how we need to rebalance the focus on the cognition to also think about the affective and embodied domain. Now, have you heard of the Bloom's taxonomy? Yes, I know it's very popular, right? The Bloom's taxonomy. But do you know that when Bloom developed his taxonomy, he wanted to have 3 taxonomies. One for cognition, one for emotion, and one for psychomotor. Well, in his life, he didn't manage to do all 3. He focused on the cognition taxonomy that we are all familiar with. But later on, his PhD student developed the one for emotions, and his colleague later on developed the one for the psychomotor. So they're available, and if you read the paper, you can find them, but it has never been taken up very seriously in our education system, in our schools, because there's a preoccupation of cognition. Perhaps in the age of generative AI, when the machine is able to generate very low level cognitive output, we need to pay a little bit more attention to affect and emotions, as well as to the embodied learning experiences. Perhaps in the age of social media, where there's concern about fake news, distrust of the content that we read, we need to focus a little bit more about emotions and affect, and how texts are designed as a way to, well, in a sense, manipulate and persuade students' responses. So, of course, if you look at the learning by design framework that we have earlier, this is one way in which we can think about the social and material focus by drawing attention to some of the pedagogies that we are already familiar with, bring them into the classroom a little bit more. So, for instance, a focus on drawing on the students' life world relating to their life experiences can bring in the aspect of social emotion and embodied domains into learning. Now, I am at the National Institute of Education. Nanyang Technological University, and I teach both pre-service students, so student teachers, as well as graduate students. And I have always been thinking about this scenario that I've experienced. I have two students, right? Bing, a rather lackadaisical attitude, but he scores A's in the exams. Sing, these are very Singaporean names in case you're wondering, okay? Great attitude, but doesn't do so well in the exam, he scores B. So who do you think is the better student? Sing? Bing? Bing always comes late for school, for class. Sometimes he doesn't turn up, but he does well. Well, if you focus on the paradigm of learning as competence, if you focus on learning as products, you would think that Bing is the one that would do well. But really, I mean, is that really the case? Which is why I'm arguing that we need to think a little bit more about the learning processes. Learning processes is about recognizing students' signs of learning beyond the singular focus on the product of learning. So how can we do that? Well, it involves exploration with emerging technologies. So think about the affordances of Gen AI, multimodal learning analytics, and how they offer promises of automated analysis of data, learning processes, and even physiological data of students to inform of the process of how they are learning. It enables the principles of recognizing students' learning as design beyond the view of learning as competence, and more importantly, it is able to provide timely and quality feedback on the students for their learning. So this is a project that I was involved in Singapore. Essentially, it's a learning management platform thinking about how we can use the data that students develop. Well, they're producing as they engage on the collaborative learning as they engage on a collaborative reading process, to begin to help them, offer them a mirror to think about their learning experience. So this particular project focuses on collaborative reading on the digital platform. So if you think about reading, traditionally it's very solitary, lonely, but well, online it can be made collaborative where you get them to comment and collaborate on each other's responses. But more importantly, well, you are able also to have data to give them a sense of how they have been communicating with one another. Whereas students, they were left out in the discussion, well, a social network analysis can show you that. What about the nature of comments they were making? Are they challenging one another all the time? Or are they building on each other's responses? Are they being evasive in their responses? Or are they being open to different perspectives? So we are able to have a chart to offer a mirror for the students, as well as for the teachers to have a sense of what are some of the strengths and limitations in the classroom. So this is one example of a project that I'm co-PI with. The PI is Elizabeth Koh, and we are looking at how a simple use of data analytics can give us insights on learning as a process. There's another ongoing project now, again led by my colleague Elizabeth Koh, and it's about developing a multimodal learning analytics approach to measure engagement as students use learning analytics systems and dashboards. Now, I do not know about the context that you come from, but in Singapore, there's a gradual increase in terms of interest on how we can design for better online learning experiences for students. So in fact, in Singapore, what we have done is that since COVID, we know that our teachers have done admirably during COVID when we had to change to emergency online learning, right? And I'm sure in many countries that was the case. But one of the takeaways that we had was that our teachers, even though they did admirably, they were not really trained to do online learning, to design for online learning experiences. And so the ministry decided to make a hard decision. They decided to make blended learning, online learning, a regular feature of our secondary school education. So what this means is that for one day, every 2 weeks, students will stay at home and they will learn online. And that provides the opportunity for teachers to hone their pedagogies to design for online learning experiences as well. So online learning wasn't just reserved for emergencies or pandemics, but we wanted to build capacity within the system to do that. And one of the ways to support that was, of course, through learning platforms. We have the student learning spaces. But because of the interest, we were also keen to understand whether students will engage, during online learning. How can we have a sense of their learning processes as they read the articles, perform various tasks? So this particular project is exploratory, it's fun. We we video record the students' expressions, and we begin to have a sense of their engagement as they use various dashboards. So it's a fun project, it's ongoing, coming to an end soon, and I will be able to share with you some results in time to come. So if you're interested in some of the work that I have done, but more importantly, also colleagues internationally that has used the lens of multimodality to think about learning as a process, and to think about how we can design meaningful learning experiences. We have a collected volume on designing learning with digital technologies. I know that there are many books that talk about the use of technologies, but here we have curated papers from leading researchers that are doing work with the lens of multimodality and design that I have talked to you about. And they may be useful for you. If you're interested in reread, the project that I talked about earlier is a chapter in this book as well. Now, in the last 10 minutes or so, I will talk about generative AI. Some of you may sigh, some of you may look excited. Yes. I spoke to a very senior colleague, very senior in years. He's in his 80s now, and he has seen through waves of changes in the education, the internet, mobile phones, social media, and now generative AI. And he's in his 80s and he's actively exploring generative AI, playing with it almost every other day. And he tells me, Victor, Gen AI is the game changer for education. It can essentially reset education, teaching, learning, and assessment if you take it seriously. What is Gen AI? Well, regular AI is something that you are all familiar with. I mean, if you unlock your phone with your facial recognition, if you go on Netflix, Amazon, and they recommend you items, well, that's regular AI. But generative AI is creation AI, and I don't think it needs further introduction because I'm sure many of you have tried it. If you have not, please do. I think as teachers, you have the responsibility. As educational researchers, you have the incentive to find out more about this. Now, when it first came on the scene in 2022, in November, I wrote an article in the Singapore Straits Times, right, on how ChatGPT offers questions about teaching and learning in a classroom. Obviously, the font is too small, you can't read it. So I got ChatGPT to summarize it for you, but you may feel that, it's still too long, I'm too tired to read it. Well, it's further summarized. Well, some of you are more literary, and I say, maybe I like it to see it as a sonnet. So this is how ChatGPT has done that. And of course, if you prefer a haiku, since we are in Asia, this is the essence of the article. But really, is this the article? What is loss and gain as we go through the process of translation? And I know many of my students are now coming to class claiming to have read the readings because they have used ChatGPT, maybe to summarize the long 28-page article into a haiku, and they say, I have read it. Sure. What is loss and gain in the process? And obviously, Midjourney, of course, recently, in the last 2 weeks or so, if you're on social media, you have seen Midjourney and ChatGPT being used to create images by Studio Gabriel. So you will know that it's very powerful. But as I use that, I also tried to say, okay, let's do something interesting. Since I'm coming for this conference, why don't you show them what Singapore is? So I asked them to create an image of Singapore. Now, how many of you have been to Singapore? Yes? Yes? Some of you, if not, you must come. It's a beautiful city. But when I look at the image that they created, I say, but that's not really the Singapore I know. When I look out of the window, I see this. So why did Midjourney generate this? And I got really intrigued. How does it select the pictures that I want to see? So I say, create an image of a professor. I'm sorry for the ladies here. I'm really sorry, but you can be a teacher. I'm sorry. Create an image of a doctor. There you go. And you can be a nurse. The point is that these are stereotype prejudice 101, isn't it? That is perpetuated by some of this AI tool. And I'm not alone in recognizing this. I mean, there's a recognition that we need to have critical multimodal literacy, especially in the age of generative AI, when this content are generated so quickly and many times taken as unproblematic by students who use them. But they are really problematic stereotypes, isn't it? So how can we then think about how Gen AI is actually reinforcing some of these hegemonic values that can be problematized, that needs to be problematized. So some of this work that needs to be done in this regard. And of course, in the Singapore context, when the ministry starts to use generative AI for their images, well, the response from the public is not necessarily positive. I mean, they think about how very scary AI-generated images are made. So this particular episode where the ministry started to use ChatGPT, Midjourney to generate images for their publicity, got me thinking about perceptions of people. And what does it mean to be really critical, or what does it mean to be literate in today's age? We talk about the importance of critical thinking, but there have also been a recognition that there are changes in what we understand critical thinking to be in today's age of generative AI. A shift from information gathering to information verification, a shift from problem solving to AI response integration, a shift from task execution to task stewardship. So even the notion of critical thinking that we take as it is also changing in today's age. Now, the term generative AI was coined by John McCarthy for a small workshop led at Dartmouth College. And the notion of generative AI has been challenged as the notion of artificial intelligence has been challenged, because artificial intelligence here is about making machines behave in ways that will be called intelligent, as if a human was behaving. So the term artificial intelligence has been challenged because the question of intelligence is problematized. Machines are very good at calculations, and of course they are exceedingly superior than humans in terms of speed of calculation. But have we all been tricked to think about machines as being intelligent just because they are good at calculation? And the idea is whether we are giving it more credit, and we need to unpack what we understand as thinking and intelligence. Now, there are some challenges, of course, to think about machines as intelligent. Well, epistemological, because they have no theory of knowledge. Emotional, there's no theory of mind, and therefore we need to focus on training students to develop and recognize their emotions in a classroom. Ethical, there are no values beyond what has been programmed to them. Existential, obviously, they have no purpose. So are they really intelligent when they have they are sorely lacking in these aspects? In a work that Bill and Mary have done in terms of Gen AI coming to school, they make an argument of how Gen AI can perhaps be harmful for learning for the various reasons. And if you're interested, you can read the article. The machine buries its sources. Over time, it's getting better. It still does bury its sources. It has no notion of empirical truth. It has no conception of theoretical frame. Ethics we have talked about. And of course, there's this feigned anthropomorphism. It pretends to be a very good interactor. I mean, someone that can, conversational partner, right? But really is skewed towards being uncritically affirmative. And if any one of you have worked with Gen AI before, you know that it is essentially designed as a way to always apologize to you and agree with you most of the time, right? So what then should we do? Given that we recognize that Gen AIs can be harmful for learning, should we then protest against the use of Gen AI? Or should we just move on and say, well, I'm retired or I'm retiring in a few years' time, so it's not my problem. It's something for the next generation to think about as life goes on. Well, I don't know whether you are using Gen AI, but studies have shown, this is from the UK, but it's similar in Singapore, and I'm very sure it's similar in your own context as well, that students are using Gen AI. In fact, they are motivated to survive their assignments, so they have to use Gen AI to develop the product, the essays that you want them to do. So if students are using Gen AI, then what about us as educators and education researchers? Very early on when ChatGPT was developed, Khan Academy, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, claims that they are using Gen AI and students are asking better questions. International Baccalaureate, again, very early when ChatGPT was announced, just a few months later, say that, well, we're going to allow ChatGPT in our essays. In schools in Singapore, our Minister of Education says that, well, students and teachers will have to learn how to use ChatGPT, but in a very unique Singapore style, to use it properly. So the idea of ChatGPT being used in the classroom when students have mastered the basics. So the idea really is about how we are incorporating ChatGPT, Gen AI, into the teaching and learning of the classroom. And this is, again, a Singapore context where we are going to deploy more AI tools. So we are not fighting it, we are not ignoring it, we are deploying more tools into the classroom. And in fact, we have just rolled out our new AgTech Master Plan 2030 to talk about AI in education. So a keen focus on that. So what I did with a student in the National Institute of Education is to understand how pre-service teachers themselves, student teachers themselves, are reacting to the development of Gen AI. So we had exchange students from different educational contexts that were with us, and the papers will be out soon, but one of the key takeaways from the findings that we have is that the first-hand experience of students is very powerful. So those students who have themselves tried using Gen AI for themselves, those who have used it for their play or learning, are more open to the use of Gen AI in the classroom. So one of the takeaway message we had was that, okay, we just got to try using it, start using it in our classroom. I had a master student came to me last year saying that she wants to do a systematic review of Gen AI for literacy development. And I said, no, usually systematic review is done when you have a number of studies, usually over a 10-year period. This has only been for about 2 years plus. I don't think you will have enough articles to do a meaningful systematic review. She proved me wrong, and we got published. There has been 42 articles in the last 2 years or so that has looked at Gen AI specific for the literacy classroom, for primary and secondary school. So you realize that all around the world, not just the students are using Gen AI, researchers themselves are also very interested in the phenomenon of Gen AI in education. And this is something that I will encourage all of you to think about in your role, that Gen AI development should not be steered by just the programmers, the computer scientists, but it should be also steered by education researchers as well as teachers. So very quickly, if you look at this particular essay, and you think about the two feedback, which one do you think is generated by Gen AI? The answer is, because you have to go for your break, both. If you think about what good feedback looks like, and this is a familiar rubric from principles from Black and Williams, you'll realize that, well, to give timely feedback can be challenging when I have 45 students in a classroom. Specific, descriptive, actionable, constructive. At the end of it all, you probably suffer from a heart attack or something as a teacher because it's so much work for a teacher to be able to do that. But Gen AI is able to provide timely, quality feedback for the students. If you look at the two examples, for this, it was a study that we did. We really got a teacher, a primary school teacher, to give feedback on an essay on language on the left, and Gen AI offered feedback as well. And we got the teacher to give feedback on the content. By the end of marking this essay, the teacher was a bit tired. But you can see the comparison between the two sets of feedback. Both are equally valuable and useful, but the difference was that the feedback on the right-hand side was generated in a few seconds. So Gen AI has been used in the classroom in different ways. I mean, Mike Sharpers, a professor from Open University, has talked about different ways in which pedagogies can be innovated using Gen AI. And these are some ways that he has described in his paper. And if you're interested, of course, you can take a look at the paper that was published in one of the NIE journals as well. I will conclude with this. Gen AI offers the opportunity for us to rethink teaching and learning, to think about learning as a process, but more importantly also to think about how we can recognize students' signs of learning beyond just the product, the essay, which is now so easily generated by Gen AI. ChatGPT is now allowed in international baccalaureate essays, but Glenville says that essay writing is, however, being profoundly challenged by the rise of new technology, and there's no doubt that it will have much less prominence in the future. We have always privileged essay writing. We have relied on it as a singular way to assess students' learning, the product of learning. So if we are going to rely on it less, if it has less prominence, then what should we be using? How should we be understanding students' signs of learning? Well, the challenge is up to all of us here in this room. There's this current project that I'm doing, and it's provocatively titled, "Does the Teacher Matter?" Of course it does. But really, does it? Yeah, I'm sure it does. But what we wanted to do was to look at, earlier on I have already laid the premise that Gen AI is very good at offering feedback. It can be used obviously through studies that have shown that it's good for brainstorming. But I was interested in the students' reception to it. So we got two groups of students, and we say, now, you have to, both of you generate and you have both do an essay, but you can brainstorm with a chatbot for 20 minutes, or you can brainstorm with a teacher online for 20 minutes. And we are going to, look at your essay generated, essay outline generated. We are going to look at your reflections, but we are also going to measure your heart rate to have a sense of your engagement, your boredom, your interest. Right? So we did that for two groups. And we wanted to have a sense of whether they enjoy and like generating ideas using a chatbot as compared to a teacher. Who do you think won? Who do you think they like better? A teacher? But I can tell you, we had a real life teacher do it. And after a few sessions, he told me, you should be measuring my heart rate. You know, it was beating so fast. I was so angry and tired. Yeah, okay, but unfortunately we didn't collect that. But who do you think they like better? Chatbot? Teachers? Chatbot? Teachers? You got to read my findings, right? Yeah, the jury is out there. Does the teacher matter? Of course it does. But can it be supported by a chatbot meaningfully? Perhaps it can. Right? So this is what we did. But there's another study that we are doing now where we are trying to develop our own chatbot to help our graduate students develop critical reasoning and academic writing with Gen AI tools. So I will conclude with this. This was an interview that I did with colleagues. And I talk about how the ability to discern, evaluate text in order to understand their quality, veracity, and values have become a lot more vital. We talk about developing students' creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication in the digital age. Now, Gen AI is the game changer. The responsibility and challenge really for us as educators is to recognize the students' science of learning in today's digital age, where we can no longer just rely on traditional measures like essays, right? So that is the challenge that will allow all of us, I hope, to rise up to the occasion and think about how teaching and learning and assessment can be transformed. Now, I like this article, and it talks about how, and I quote them, Bill and Mary, we use the remarkable multimodality of the new medium to do the same old stuff. Print textbook became e-textbook. In-person lectures became video lectures. Teacher-led classroom discussions became video conference discussion. Select response tests were automated, and the lockstep syllabus became the lockstep learning management system. And the observation they made was that with the advent of digital learning, a lot of traditional pedagogies remain the same. So teacher-centered content transmission culminating in tests of long-term memory, which is a little sad, isn't it? With the affordance of technology that's given to us. But in the era of cloud computing, of generative AI that we have today, I believe that reform in education is now possible because we can think about the affordance of the digital. Things that may be hard to do in the past, if you think about personalized learning, timely feedback, detailed feedback that is actionable for every child in the classroom, understanding the learning process of the students so that we don't just rely on the product of learning. All these were all ideals in the sky a long time ago. But today, all ideals could at last be realized through the affordances of the digital. And today I want to encourage you, as we go through the next few days of conferencing, to think about these possibilities. Perhaps when you started as a young teacher, you had some ideals of teaching and learning, but the realities of the classroom can be quite discouraging and disheartening, the challenges of work-life balance and whatnot. But think about the possibilities of technology and how learning in the age of generative AI can be remarkable. Thank you.